The dust of Oakhaven clung to Ilara's worn skirts, a gritty testament to her daily battle. It settled in the creases of her too thin face, mirrored the gray in her eyes that had seen too much hardship for 22 years. Beside her, Leo, all of 8 years, coughed, a dry, rasping sound that tore at her heart more than any physical blow. His small hand, hot and fragile, clutched hers. "Almost home, Leo," she murmured, her voice a low reassurance she scarcely felt herself. Home was a single rented room at the back of Mrs. Blank, Henderson's boarding house, smelling perpetually of stale linen and despair. The town doctor, a man whose gaze carried the weight of too many lost causes, had been blunt. "Better air, child, good food, rest, things this town can't offer him, not with your means." Consumption, he'd called it, a word that whispered of slow fading, of inevitable loss. Ilara worked herself to the bone, mending for the mercantile, scrubbing floors at the saloon after hours, but it was never enough. The coins in her purse were few, her hope even scarcer. Townsfolk whispered, their pity edged with judgment. A young woman alone, with a sick brother, a burden. Caleb Thorne was a silhouette against the setting sun more often than a man of flesh and blood to most of Oakhaven. He kept to his ranch, miles out, a place spoken of as harsh and unforgiving as the man himself. He came to town for supplies, his face weathered leather, eyes the pale, distant blue of a winter sky. He spoke little, observed much. Ilara had felt his gaze on her sometimes, discomfortingly direct, as she hurried Leo through the dusty street. She dismissed it as the idle curiosity of a solitary man. One sweltering afternoon, as Ilara coaxed Leo to eat a spoonful of thin broth, a shadow fell across their doorway. Caleb Thorne stood there, hat in hand, filling the narrow frame. His presence was overwhelming, smelling of dust, horses, and open spaces. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. Ilara's heart hammered. "Mr. Thorne." Leo coughed again, burrowing closer to her. Caleb's gaze flickered to the boy, then back to Ilara. "Heard about your trouble, about the boy." His words were clipped, devoid of overt sympathy, yet not unkind. "We manage," Ilara said, a thread of defiance stitching through her weariness. Thorne nodded slowly. "I've a proposition, a practical one." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. "My ranch needs a woman's hand. The house, it's functional but no home. I need someone to manage it, cook, clean, keep things in order." Ilara stared, confusion warring with a rising dread. "You're looking for a housekeeper, Mr. Thorne?" "More than that." His gaze was unwavering. "I'm proposing marriage, ma'am." The breath caught in Ilara's throat. Heat flooded her face, a mixture of shame and disbelief. "Marriage," she whispered, the word tasting alien on her tongue. "A marriage of convenience," he stated, his tone flat, businesslike. "You'd have a roof, good food. My ranch has clean air, miles from this dust. The boy would have a warm room, nourishment. I can provide for medicines if needed." He held up a hand as she started to speak. "This ain't for love, ma'am. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not a man for sentiment. It's an arrangement. I need a wife to run my household, to ensure there's order, someone to be there. And you need security for your brother." The words, stark and unadorned, hung in the oppressive air of the small room. Humiliation washed over Ilara, hot and sharp, to be bartered for a necessity like flour or a new saddle. Yet, beneath the sting, a desperate, pragmatic part of her mind latched onto his words: clean air, good food, medicines, for Leo. Her gaze fell to her brother, his skin almost translucent, his breathing shallow. The doctor's words echoed, "No hope here." Caleb Thorne was offering a sliver, wrapped in the coarsest of cloth. "Why me?" she finally managed, her voice tight. "You're capable. You're devoted to the boy. I've seen it. You don't shirk work." He paused. "And you have no other prospects that I can see that would offer him what he needs." The truth of it was another small, sharp stone in her shoe. Ilara's mind raced. Her pride, her dreams of a love match, however faded, crumbled against the stark reality of Leo's fading life. Could she condemn him to this slow decline because her own heart recoiled from such a barren union? He needs a future," she said, more to herself than to Thorne. "I can offer him a chance at one," Caleb replied, his voice still even. "The ranch is isolated, but it's healthy land." She looked at Leo, smoothing his hair back from his damp forehead. His eyes, too large in his small face, pleaded silently. Not for anything specific, just for relief, for comfort, for her. The fight went out of her, the pride, the shame, all of it receded before the overwhelming tide of love for her brother. I accept, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice barely audible. The words felt like a surrender, yet also like the first step onto a treacherous, unknown path. He nodded once, a curt acknowledgement. "Be ready to leave in 2 days. The preacher can say the words before we go. I'll bring a wagon." He placed his hat back on his head, his shadow retreating from the doorway, leaving Ilara in a silence more profound than before. Leo looked up at her. "Are we going away, Ilara?" She pulled him close, burying her face in his thin hair, the scent of his sickness a familiar ache. "Yes, my love, we're going to a place where you can get better, a place with clean air." She didn't say it was a place where her heart might turn to stone. That she would bear alone. The journey to Thorne's ranch was a blur of jolting wagon wheels and endless, rolling plains under a vast, indifferent sky. The ceremony before they left Oakhaven had been a stark, brief affair in the preacher's dusty parlor, witnessed by the preacher's stoic wife. Caleb had stood beside her, solid and unreadable, his responses as economical as his conversation. Ilara had felt like a ghost at her own wedding, her vows whispered into a void. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was nestled in a shallow valley, a sturdy but unadorned wooden house flanked by a barn and corrals. It was, as Caleb had said, isolated. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, a lonely sound. Inside, the house was clean but stark, echoing with emptiness. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, the scent of Caleb himself. The first weeks were a careful dance of avoidance and necessity. Ilara threw herself into making the house a home, or at least more habitable. She scrubbed floors already clean, aired out rooms that had been shut for too long, and cooked meals that Caleb ate in near silence, his gaze often fixed on some distant point beyond the window. He was not unkind, but his presence was a constant reminder of the transactional nature of their lives. He rose before dawn, worked until dusk, his energy seeming boundless, his face a mask of stoic endurance. He ensured Leo had the best room, a small chamber at the back that caught the morning sun. He provided fresh milk from their single cow, and eggs from a small flock of chickens. Ilara saw Leo's breathing ease slightly in the clearer air, a faint touch of color returned to his cheeks. This small, fragile improvement was the bedrock of her own endurance. Leo, initially wary of the large, quiet man, slowly began to explore his new world. He'd sit on the porch watching Caleb work with the horses, his small face solemn. Caleb, in turn, largely ignored the boy, though Ilara sometimes saw his gaze soften for a fleeting moment when he thought no one was looking. One evening, Caleb returned from the range and silently placed a roughly carved wooden bird on the porch railing near Leo. He offered no explanation, just walked into the house. Leo had stared at it for a long time before tentatively reaching for the small token. Alara's days were filled with a rhythm of work. She mended Caleb's worn shirts, noting the strength in the seams that had held against hard labor, the faint scent of horse and sun woven into the fabric. She baked bread, the aroma filling the silent house with a semblance of warmth. Sometimes she would find a bucket of fresh well water on the porch that she hadn't drawn, or a stack of firewood neatly cut and placed by the door. Small, unspoken gestures that were neither kindness nor cruelty, but simply provision. Loneliness was a constant companion. She missed the small interactions of Oakhaven, even the pitying glances. Here, there was only the wind, the vast sky, and the silent man who was her husband in name only. Her inner world was a landscape of carefully tended grief for the life she hadn't had, and a fierce, protective love for Leo, which fueled her every action. She would watch Caleb from the window, his figure lean and powerful as he moved across the land, a man as rugged and unyielding as the terrain itself. She wondered about the life he'd lived, the reasons for his solitude, but his closed expression offered no invitation for questions. One afternoon, a sudden squall blew in, the sky turning a bruised purple-black. Rain lashed down, turning the yard to mud. A calf, separated from its mother, bawled in distress near the creek, which was beginning to swell. Caleb was out checking fence lines. Without a second thought, Alara pulled on an old oilskin slicker of Caleb's that hung by the door and ran out. The wind tore at her, the rain blinding. She fought her way to the terrified calf, her skirts heavy with mud. Just as she reached it, Caleb appeared on horseback, his face grim. He dismounted, his movements efficient. "Fool thing to do," he grunted, but there was no real anger in his voice. Together, they half-carried, half-dragged the struggling calf through the mud and rising water towards the barn. They worked in tandem, their bodies brushing, the shared urgency a temporary bridge over the chasm of their usual distance. Back in the relative dryness of the barn, soaked and shivering, Alara looked at Caleb. His hair was plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his jaw. For a moment, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He gestured towards the house. "Go, get warm." "You too," she managed, her teeth chattering. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before he turned back to the calf. Later that evening, after Leo was asleep, Alara sat by the small fire, mending a tear in her dress from the afternoon's exertions. Caleb sat opposite, cleaning a piece of tack, the silence filled only by the crackle of flames and the sigh of the wind outside. "The calf will be all right," he said, not looking at her. "Good," she replied softly. Another silence. Then, "That was brave, what you did." Ilara's needle stilled. She looked up, surprised. Praise, however understated, was rare from him. It needed help. He nodded, his gaze finally meeting hers. "Still, could have waited for me." "It might have been too late," she said simply. His eyes held hers for a long moment, a moment where something unspoken passed between them. A grudging respect, perhaps, or the first fragile thread of shared experience. Then he looked back down at his work, the mask of inscrutability settling back into place. But Alara felt a tiny shift within her, a flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Leo, emboldened by Caleb's gift of the wooden bird, began to leave his own small offerings for the quiet man, a particularly smooth stone found by the creek, a brightly colored feather. Caleb never acknowledged them directly, but Alara noticed they were never discarded. They would simply appear on the windowsill in the kitchen or on the mantelpiece, silent testament to a child's hesitant outreach. One evening, Leo had a bad coughing spell, worse than any since they'd arrived. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Ilara. She held him, murmuring reassurances, while her own heart pounded. Caleb appeared in the doorway of Leo's small room, his face etched with concern that seemed to go beyond mere obligation. He didn't say much, just fetched a cool cloth for Leo's forehead and then stood awkwardly by, his large presence surprisingly comforting. When the coughing finally subsided and Leo drifted into an exhausted sleep, Caleb looked at Ilara. "He seems frailer tonight," he said, his voice low. "It comes and goes," Ilara whispered, weariness dragging at her. "But the good days are more frequent here." Caleb nodded. "The air is good. He needs to build his strength." He paused, then added, almost hesitantly, "You do good by him, Ilara." It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded unfamiliar, yet strangely right, in his deep voice. She met his gaze, and for a moment, the pretense of their arrangement seemed to thin, revealing a glimpse of two lonely people bound by circumstance and a shared concern for a child. The slow rhythm of the seasons turned. Summer's fierce heat mellowed into the golden hues of autumn. Leo grew stronger, the hollows in his cheeks filling out, his laughter, when it came, less fragile. He spent hours outdoors, fascinated by the workings of the ranch, sometimes even helping Caleb with small tasks. His chest puffed with importance when Caleb allowed him to carry a small tool or fetch a dipper of water. Ilara found a quiet contentment in her routines. The house felt less empty now, more lived in. She'd begun to plant a small herb garden near the kitchen door, the scent of thyme and sage a welcome fragrance. Caleb remained a man of few words, but the silences between them were less strained, sometimes even comfortable. He would watch her as she worked in the garden or read to Leo by the firelight in the evenings, a peculiar expression on his face she couldn't quite decipher, not tenderness, not exactly, but something akin to thoughtful observation. One crisp fall morning, a wagon rumbled into their valley. It was Jedediah Franks, a rancher from a neighboring valley, a man known for his bluster and his tendency to pry. "Thorn," Franks boomed, climbing down from his wagon. "Heard you finally got yourself a woman to tame this wilderness. And a ready-made family, too, I see." His eyes, small and assessing, swept over Ilara and then lingered on Leo, who shyly hid behind Ilara's skirts. Caleb stepped forward, his stance unyielding. "Franks, what brings you out this way?" His tone was level, but Ilara sensed a coiled tension in him. "Just being neighborly," Franks said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Heard the boy was sickly. Surprised you took on such a burden, Thorn. Always figured you for a man who traveled light." A cold anger tightened Ilara's chest. Before she could speak, Caleb moved slightly, positioning himself almost imperceptibly between Franks and her and Leo. "My wife and son are my concern, Franks," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. "Not yours." He used the word son deliberately. Ilara knew. It was a shield, a claim. Franks's eyes widened slightly at Caleb's tone. He held up his hands in a placating gesture. "No offense meant, Thorn, just making conversation." "Some conversations are best left unmade," Caleb replied, his gaze like chips of ice. "If you've no other business." Franks, clearly discomfited, mumbled something about needing to check a stray steer and made a hasty retreat. Ilara watched him go, her heart still beating fast. She turned to Caleb, who was already walking towards the barn, his shoulders set. Later, when he returned to the house for the midday meal, she said quietly, "Thank you." He merely grunted, avoiding her gaze. But as he sat down to eat, he met her eyes briefly, and there was a flicker of something there, protectiveness perhaps, or a shared understanding of the line he had drawn in the dust for them. That night, as she lay in her separate bed, the word son echoed in her mind. It was a lie, of course, a convenience like their marriage. But it had felt for a moment like a shield forged not of pragmatism, but of something stronger. Winter arrived, blanketing the ranch in snow, isolating them further. The days grew short, the nights long. It was during this enforced proximity that the fragile truce between Alara and Caleb began to deepen into something less defined, yet more profound. They worked together to ensure the animals were safe and fed, the house warm. One evening, a blizzard raged outside, rattling the windows, the wind howling like a hungry wolf. Leo was asleep, and Ilara sat by the fire, reading, while Caleb repaired a broken bridle. The silence was companionable. Suddenly, a particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the house, and a loose shutter on an upstairs window tore free, banging repeatedly. "I'll get it," Caleb said, rising. "It's too dangerous out there," Alara protested. "Wait until morning." "It'll break the glass if I leave it." He was already pulling on his heavy coat. Impulsively, she stood. "Then I'm coming with you, to hold the lantern." He hesitated, then nodded curtly. Outside, the storm was a maelstrom of driving snow and biting wind. Alara shielded the lantern as best she could, its flickering light barely piercing the darkness, while Caleb, battling the elements, fought to secure the rogue shutter. Snow caked their clothes, stung their faces. At one point, he slipped on the icy ground, and she reached out instinctively, her mittened hand grabbing his arm to steady him. Their eyes met in the swirling snow, a moment of shared struggle, of reliance. When the shutter was finally secured, they stumbled back inside, gasping, their clothes stiff with ice. They were both shivering violently. "Fire," Ilara managed, her teeth chattering. Caleb was already adding logs to the hearth. He stripped off his frozen gloves and chafed his hands. Ilara did the same, her fingers numb. He glanced at her, her face pale, her lips tinged with blue. Without a word, he took her hands in his. His own were rough, calloused, but surprisingly warm. He rubbed her frozen fingers, his touch firm, impersonal, yet undeniably solicitous. "Better?" he asked after a moment, his voice still gruff. She nodded, unable to speak, a strange warmth spreading through her that had little to do with the reviving circulation in her hands. It was the first time he had touched her with such direct, unthinking care. He released her hands as quickly as he'd taken them and turned back to the fire, but the moment lingered in the air, charged and significant. The deep winter passed. Leo's cough had all but vanished, replaced by the robust energy of a healthy boy. He was thriving, and his joy was a light in the house. Ilara watched him race Caleb to the barn one morning, his laughter echoing in the crisp air, and a profound gratitude filled her. This stark, loveless arrangement had given her brother back his life. One early spring day, Caleb announced he had to ride to a distant settlement, 2 days' journey, for vital supplies they couldn't get in Oakhaven. It would be the first time he'd been gone overnight since they'd arrived. "You'll be all right here?" he asked, an uncharacteristic note of concern in his voice as he surveyed Ilara and Leo. "We'll be fine," Ilara assured him, though a small knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. She'd grown accustomed to his steady, silent presence. He nodded, then hesitated. There's a rifle above the mantel, loaded, just in case." Her eyes widened slightly. "In case of what, Caleb?" "Wolves, maybe. Or, just be careful." He mounted his horse, then looked down at them, his gaze lingering on Leo, then on her. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, but he just touched the brim of his hat and rode out, his figure diminishing against the vast landscape. The first day passed quietly. Ilara kept busy, Leo chattering beside her, but as dusk fell, an unnerving stillness settled over the ranch. The sounds of Caleb's return, the creak of his saddle, the stamp of his boots, sounds she hadn't realized she listened for, were absent. The rifle above the mantel seemed to loom larger in the dim light. The next day, Leo developed a fever. It came on suddenly, his skin hot and dry, his eyes overly bright. By afternoon he was listless, a faint rasp returning to his breathing. Panic, cold and swift, seized Ilara. She sponged him with cool water, forced broth between his lips, her mind racing. The doctor in Oakhaven was a day's ride away, and Caleb was further. As night fell, Leo's breathing grew shallower. He was delirious, muttering incomprehensibly. Ilara knelt beside his small bed, her heart a stone in her chest. All the progress, all the hope, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. She prayed, a desperate, incoherent plea to a God she wasn't sure listened anymore. She thought of Caleb, his strength, his quiet competence. If only he were here. It must have been well past midnight when she heard it, the sound of a horse ridden hard. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her despair. She rushed to the door, flinging it open. Caleb practically fell from his horse, his face grim, etched with exhaustion. He must have ridden non-stop. "What is it?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her face, then darting towards Leo's room. "I had a feeling, couldn't shake it. Turned back early this morning." "It's Leo," she choked out. He's so sick, Caleb." He was past her in an instant, kneeling by Leo's bed. He touched the boy's forehead, his rough hand surprisingly gentle. His expression was stark. "He's burning up," he said. He looked at Ilara, his eyes dark with a concern that mirrored her own. "How long?" "Since yesterday. It got worse so fast." For the next few hours they fought for Leo together. Caleb seemed to know instinctively what to do, his actions born of some deep, untapped well of experience or intuition. He bathed Leo in cool water, held him when the chills racked his small frame, his low voice murmuring reassurances Ilara hadn't known he possessed. Ilara, drawing strength from his presence, followed his lead, her earlier panic subsiding into a focused determination. They moved around the small room in a silent, efficient ballet of shared purpose, the boundaries of their arrangement dissolving in the face of a common fear. As dawn approached, painting the sky in pale, hopeful hues, Leo's fever finally broke. His breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. Exhausted, Ilara sagged against the wall, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of gratitude. Caleb stood watching Leo, his shoulders slumped with weariness. He turned to Ilara, his face haggard in the growing light. "He'll be all right," he said, his voice husky. He walked over to her, then hesitated, his hand hovering near her shoulder before dropping to his side. "You should rest." She shook her head. "Not yet." She looked at him, really looked at him, at the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the dust of his hard ride still clinging to him, the raw emotion he couldn't quite hide. "You came back," she whispered. "You saved him." He shifted uncomfortably. He's part of this ranch, part of—" He trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. "This wouldn't be much of a place without the boy. Without you." The admission, so uncharacteristic, so profound in its simplicity, hung in the air between them. Ilara's heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. "Caleb," she began, her voice trembling. He met her gaze then, and the carefully constructed walls around him seemed to crumble. The stoicism, the distance, all of it fell away, revealing a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "Ilara," he said, her name a quiet acknowledgement. "When I was out there, all I could think about was getting back, to both of you." He took a step closer. "This arrangement, it was meant to be practical, but it ain't felt practical for a long time now." His hand came up, and this time it didn't falter. His calloused fingers gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her tear-stained cheek. His touch was hesitant, yet electric. "I don't have fine words, Ilara," he said, his voice low and rough. "Never have, but this place, it ain't just a ranch anymore. It's home, because you and Leo are here." She leaned into his touch, a sense of peace settling over her that she hadn't thought possible. The hardship, the loneliness, the unspoken sacrifices, they had all led to this moment, this quiet dawn of understanding. "It's home for us too, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It has been for a while." A slow smile, the first genuine smile Ilara had ever seen from him, transformed his weathered face, erasing years of harshness. He didn't speak again, but he didn't need to. His eyes, the color of a clear spring sky after a storm, said everything. Later that morning, as the sun warmed the valley, Ilara sat on the porch, watching Leo. He was awake, weak but smiling, sipping broth Caleb had carefully prepared. Caleb himself was mending a fence nearby, his movements imbued with a new lightness. He caught her eye and offered a small, almost shy nod. The landscape around them, once so harsh and unforgiving, now seemed to hold a quiet beauty, a promise of resilience. The wind still whispered through the grasses, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sang of shared burdens, of unexpected bonds, of a future forged not from a contract, but from the slow, steady growth of two hearts finding their way in the wilderness, together. The path ahead would still have its challenges, but Ilara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, they would face them not as two solitary figures, but as a family, their roots intertwined. Strong enough to withstand any storm. Their beginning had been barren, but Caleb Thorne had, against all odds, proposed a life, and somehow, love had found a way to bloom in the most unlikely soil. And Ilara thought, with a quiet triumph, that sometimes the most practical arrangements could lead to the most profound truths.